Scott, so great to see you again today. Glad to have you on the Cain Podcast again. I think as we begin to tell the story of Operation Pineapple Express, I actually want to start with how you feel. Virtually, approximately 1 year later from the founding of Operation Pineapple Express, how do you feel?
I mean, like right now, I still feel really, really pissed off. I mean, just angry. I mean, if I'm being honest, and I keep trying to focus on the good that came out of this and the way that people stepped up. But it's hard for me to do that when I see, so many of my friends who are just hurting so bad. Like, I mean, and I mean, really hurting. Like, I mean, guys and girls who have quit their jobs, who have, cashed in their savings accounts to try to keep their friends and their partners alive. And then also just my Afghan friends, those who made it over here, who are just really struggling with the trauma that came with this. And then so many that didn't make it out. And I don't know. It's just like, it's overwhelming. You just feel like I feel like I failed them, and I continue to fail them. And the more I try to do to figure out something, the more doors are shut in my face and in our face. And that it's just hard to get past that a year later, because it's like no one really seems to care. It's as if it never happened. And sometimes I don't know what to do with that.
Yeah, and so it sounds like the predominant emotion becomes anger. And there's a reason I ask you that, Scott, because in reading your new book, Operation Pineapple Express, one of the things, and look, I'm not saying anything is on the nose, and, history rhymes, it doesn't repeat. But, I feel like I remember something to the extent of, in Schindler's List, a sentiment at the end of, if I could only have grabbed one more, two more. And I think about the emotions you must feel. And obviously from the distance where I sit, you have to feel pride, man. You have to. I don't know what the final tally was, and I hope you share it with me. If it's 1,000, if it's 650, if it's thousands, you have to feel pride in saving so many lives. But I also understand, rationally what you're talking about. Like, I can't believe that you would feel like a failure. And yet I understand the complexities of this entire tragedy and whether or not it's, shame, pride, failure, or anger. I just can't imagine which emotion is the one that sits up front.
Yeah. It comes and goes. I will be honest with you. I feel no pride in this. And the reason is, now I do feel a lot of pride in the men and women who volunteered and did what they did. Like, I am so in awe of them and what they continue to do. There's these groups like Moral Compass and Sacred Promise, and these are men and women who fought in the longest war in our nation's history multiple times, and then came back into the fray, and just did it all again in terms of facing the kind of stuff they had faced. And I feel a ton of pride in them. I feel zero pride in me, in the sense that, like, I don't know. It's just, ever since this has started, I've felt like I've been out over my skis. I've tried to keep people connected and where I can, but it was really a lot of people who led this thing far better than I did. I'm in awe of them, man. I mean, but I feel like in a lot of ways we've not done right by them.
Well, and you have to know whether or not it's me speaking for myself or me speaking for or so many people who are listening and watching right now. I'm in awe of you as an individual, but also as part of a group. And you begin to describe that group.
Thank you.
And so let's do that. Let's talk about what happened 1 year ago. Let's talk about the subject matter of your new book, Operation Pineapple Express, the incredible story of a group of Americans who undertook one last mission and honored a promise to Afghanistan. What was Operation Pineapple Express?
It just started out, sometimes... It just started out as a friend who was in trouble, and it was this young man named Nizam, an Afghan commando that I've known since 2010. He's Afghan Special Forces. He's even been to our qualification course, the Q course, as they call it at Fort Bragg. He's a graduate of that. He's a Green Beret. He's part of our regiment. And he started contacting me early last summer that his special immigration visa, he was out of the Army. He had seen a lot of trauma, 7 years of nonstop fighting. And he was just night terrors, all of the stuff that our soldiers and warriors experience times probably 10. Because those guys don't get a break. They don't get a rotation, like they just keep going. Anyway, he was in a position where his SIV was not approved after a year. He was getting texts from the Taliban as province after province fell saying, we know right where you are. We're coming for you. And he was hiding in his uncle's house, and his uncle was starting to get a bit squirrely because he was, basically putting the whole family at risk. And so he was telling Nizam he was going to have to leave. And this kid had nowhere to go, man. Like he had nothing, and I'm sitting here thinking, okay, 20 years after the collapse, I'm watching the Taliban parade around in our gear and our kit, and everything that I thought I knew about the world, my youth, everything is gone. And now this young man, whether he lives or dies in this moment, really represents everything for me about this war. And I think a lot of us felt that way. It was not Operation Pineapple Express at that moment. It was just my friend who did so much for me is in a serious bind and no one is helping him. And I didn't want to get involved. I left the Army because of the careerism and the direction in Afghanistan, but there was just no recourse. And it's felt like that ever since.
So I want to focus in on two parts of the story at this point that I think are more than just the details of what you're telling us, because they're symbolic of something larger. So one of those is Nizam. We're going to come back to Nizam in a moment, both as an individual and as a symbol. But also just something you just said. You said, I felt like so much of my life and my youth was simply gone with what was going down in Afghanistan. Why?
Well, I mean, my God, I mean, this started on 9/11/2001. I was a captain in the Army, and it just, I remember it just changed my whole family's life. It changed my unit's life. One of my former commanders said to me, I remember him saying to me at this point, he looked at me and he said, Scotty, for this point on, for the rest of your life, there's two modes for you. You're either in Afghanistan or you're getting ready to go back. And that became our reality. It became the reality for my three boys. It became, and look, I didn't experience a fraction of what most of our operators experienced with tons of deployments. I did 3. Some did 6, 7, 8. Some, like my friend Romy Camargo, had his C3 ruptured and can't walk. He's on a ventilator. Many of our friends, I lost 23 friends. Gold Star moms and dads and brothers and sisters that just had their lives turned upside down. Yet we just kept going. And this was a volunteer force. This was 1% of our nation just kept going and never stopped. And that's what I mean by that. And it's like it became all you knew. You gave everything to it. It was your life. And then to end the way that it ended with the visuals on the 24-hour news cycle of the Taliban strutting around in M4s and kit, driving our vehicles, beating people at checkpoints. It was just like, what do you do with that?
You know what I appreciate about that description, Scott, is I think that for most of us, as you point out, 1% of our population has the kind of investment that you do and your friends do in Afghanistan. For the rest of us, it can become an academic or an abstract argument, and it's about investment and whether or not we can truly accomplish any semblance of victory. But set all that aside. Just throw it away for a moment. What I appreciate what you just described is, for so many of you guys, it was your identity. It was your purpose, your reason for being for 2 decades. And so what you're describing, I'm assuming, is here we are last summer, and that 2 decades worth of purpose and identity and reason for being goes up in smoke like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And remember too, man, that like after the collapse on 9, I mean, we suffered the worst terror attack in our nation's history. I mean, thousands of Americans and international citizens died on that day. And it was, if you were an adult or you had cognizant memory during that time, like it was it was one of these things that galvanized in our psyche and in our soul. Like, this can't happen again. Like we dropped the ball. I mean, I remember in the special operations community, we're looking at each other going, how in God's name did this happen? Like this was on our watch, and we made pacts to ourselves, to each other. I mean, you had guys going over there, Will, who were burying, pieces of aircraft and rubble in the dirt because, a father asked you to. And we bled for 20 years to put in place a network and a capacity that would never happen again. And then, gone.
Please go ahead. Yeah.
No, that's
gone.
it. I mean, it's just, that was the other layer of it,
Hey, I want to come back to the story. We're going to come back to the story. And look, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you sharing your story, but also your heart with me and everyone listening and watching. Can I just ask you this? Again, there's this dichotomy. It's what you and, again, your brothers and sisters invested versus the rest of us, where we invested so little. Look, what I'm getting at is when you invest so little, the cost is so little. And therefore, the conclusion isn't quite as profound. I'm speaking on behalf of, look, not everyone listening. Everyone has different emotional attachments to what they've invested over the past 20 years. But it's easy to say when you're someone like me, you can never win in Afghanistan. But for someone like you, who just described not just your emotional investment, but the investment of your blood and time, the investment of the time with your family, what would have been an outcome, Scott, that would have been a win for you and for your brothers?
Yeah, I think if we had really been thoughtful and declarative about what it was that we were there to do. Yes, we were there to get Osama bin Laden for retribution. But this whole thing about, we're not there to do nation building, but we are there to do nation building. And part of the problem, I think, on this whole thing is that we had politicians and policymakers who had zero game on what it is that we needed to do there. They had no understanding of Afghanistan. They didn't try to get an understanding of Afghanistan. For example, we put in place the same warlords as ministers, as formalized, sanctioned ministers in the country that had terrorized that population during the Civil War. That is open mic night for foreign policy. Like, there's, looking back on that was just an easy thing to do. But in reality, if we had been a bit more thoughtful on, okay, what is it that we really want to do here? Well, we want to prevent Al-Qaeda from reemerging or using this as a terror safe haven. So what about just building a local capacity for an Afghan security apparatus to handle that on its own with minimal oversight? And I'll point out that, yes, we lost several thousand people in Afghanistan, but over like the last 4 or 5 years, it was like 66 people lost. It was a great cost. But when you think about foreign internal defense and building capacity inside a country for the commandos, the Afghan special forces, the KKA to stand on their own, there was a lot of work done in that capacity, and foreign internal defense, advising organizations to stand on their own. That's a multi-decade endeavor, but we've done it for a long time. We do it in Colombia, the Philippines, and that should have been what we did from Jump Street. A smaller contingent of a counter-terror force and Green Berets, Marines, and others who were skilled at by, with, and through. And all of this other 100,000 plus, industrial war complex, that's where we really missed the boat.
And the reason I ask you that, Scott, is because I want to find an answer that satisfies the American public's investment in a win, but also the investment that guys like you have made, where we're not having a conversation like the one we just had, where you feel the way you do about the last 20 years. So I wanted to find out from you what would have been the scenario where we weren't having, you and I, this conversation. Regardless of what that win might have been, Scott, what's clear is a year ago, it was failure. And so I want to return to your story now, and I want to talk about Nizam. That's where we left off. And I mentioned, I want to know Nizam as an individual, but I also want to know him as a symbol. You know, I think for many of us that watched this go down a year ago, and we're talking about how many thousands of Afghans come into the United States, and I think we raise reasonable concerns. Who are these people? You know, is everyone being vetted? But here is someone that I'm going to leave up to you to tell me how symbolic he is of the people that we needed to stand with and for. And tell me who this guy Nizam is.
Yeah, so Nizam Nizami was born in Takhar, Afghanistan, right at the end of the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. And his father was a freedom fighter and was killed when Nizam was just a few months old. A few days later, the Soviets dropped several bombs on that village, and one of them landed on Nizam's house. Everybody scrambled out of the house, and Nizam was still in his little cradle. They forgot him, and the whole house collapsed on him. And his mother went running over there along with a few other relatives. They dug through, not knowing what they were going to find, and he was still alive, like unscathed. And, you know, he went on at that point. His mother was sold into slavery, forced marriage to a man that was in his 70s. He was abusive. Nizam slept in the barn until he was 11 years old, and then he ran away from home. And he lived on the streets of Takhar his entire childhood. And bounced around from place to place doing odd jobs to feed himself. When he was 18, 17, he joined the army, the Afghan National Army. He saw the Twin Towers fall on a television in a public market, and then he saw these NATO soldiers show up in the streets, and the ANA, the Afghan National Army, was recruiting, and he joined as soon as he could. He was so short that he had to put on women's high heels to fool the recruiter that he could actually meet height weight. And then he tried out for the commandos. He, maybe weighs $105 soaking wet. Tried out for the commandos, but had lived such a life of suffering that he was born for it, and was picked up, made through selection, and then right into special forces. This guy fought literally for 7 years straight as a commando, as Afghan special forces, mission after mission. He was shot through the face, as he always walked point. When we were doing village stability operations, that local approach I was telling you about that I think would have worked. We had Afghan special forces and U.S. special forces living in villages, working with locals, helping them stand up on their own, while commandos and JSOC schwacked the Taliban at a surgical strike level. Very effective. Nizam was one of those special forces guys. Shot through the face, walking point on a patrol, and as he turned to warn his Americans, he got shot through the face. And he basically said to the team leader, just don't let the Afghans fix my teeth. If you'll let a U.S. dentist fix my teeth, I'll be back as soon as they do it. He was back on combat operations in 2.5 weeks. Shot multiple times in fights with ISIS. But the point is, like, this dude, he built so many relationships and friendships, and so many Green Berets are alive because of him. And everybody knows it. Everybody knows, anybody who fought in Afghanistan in the South knows Nizam, because he ended up going to our Q course. And this was the kind of guy that we partnered with. And then who our generals and admirals and politicians asked us to abandon. Right. And this is the guy who called us and said, nobody else is coming. What should I do? And that's who he is. And that's who so many of these people were. That's why I wrote the book in third person. Is I wanted people to meet these individuals and their families, because when you really get down to it, man, what's personal is universal. When you talk about like the kind of work Green Berets and people that you send us to do, this is what we do. We build relationships, we establish loyalties, and there's an implicit promise that I have your back, and that's why. Is because of guys like him, guys that were called the backpack man by their aunt because they would never have a home, and all of a sudden everything's falling apart around them, and they got nobody else, man. So he is very representative of who these people were in that moment of duress.
Well, that's actually where I wanted to follow up, so I'll just press you on that a little bit. So as you described Nizam, and as I've read the book, not only was he essentially lifelong warrior, 7 years straight of fighting, and you mentioned it earlier, where Green Berets and Navy SEALs and American soldiers got to take rotations back home. He never had a rotation off. He was fighting for 7 straight years. He was special forces. He went to Green Beret special training in the United States of America. So back to the kind of premise that I put to you earlier, is this someone who is vetted, that the American people can trust? The answer is a resounding, obvious, proven yes. But just to follow up on this guy is representative. So as part of Operation Pineapple Express and what we saw go down at Hamid Karzai Airport a year ago, was I looking at literally hundreds, thousands of Nizams, Scott? Are there thousands of Nizams, hundreds of Nizams still left in Afghanistan? How symbolic and representative is Nizam?
Yeah, he is in several ways. I mean, first of all, I think, to be super candid, none of us in Pineapple and all the other groups, there were so many volunteer groups, none of us thought that we were going to evacuate Afghanistan. We knew that's crazy. What we were focused on for us was our partner force, right? This was the Afghan commandos, Afghan special forces, the KKA, and the NMRG, and the special mission unit that flies missions. They've been carrying 98.9% of the fighting since 2014, when combat operations were handed over to the Afghans. And most Americans don't hear this. This very, very small contingent, much like U.S. SOCOM, carried the bulk of the fighting. They were the ones carrying the fighting. And yet they were the ones, they're not even eligible for a special immigration visa. A barber on Bagram is, right? Because he worked for the U.S. government. But these guys technically worked for the Afghan government. And so they weren't even eligible for the SIV. And so humanitarian parole was their only option. And so when the government didn't pick up the phone, and these guys they literally fought to the last bullet. They fought till the last round on the 15th. One of the characters in my book, Bashir, another Afghan Green Beret, went to our Q course. He was on Camp Moorhead. He killed 11 or 12 dudes when Kabul was falling. But these guys had no recourse. They had no way out. So of those 100,000 plus that made it here, only a fraction were the eligible individuals that should have gotten out. And those individuals, in my assessment, and I think others would back this up, were largely facilitated by these volunteer groups who knew who they were, where they were, and they trusted us to present them responsibly to the different people on the gate who weren't sure who they were.
So now let's get into that, because that is the hair-raising, behind-the-scenes details of the story from 1 year ago. So Nizam is he's out in the not the hinterlands, but he's not in Kabul when this whole story begins, and he manages to make his way to Kabul. Mm-hmm. And it is the country falling apart, I would assume, Scott, from the outside in, where Kabul, it's interesting to me as someone who's learning about it, becomes this choke point, but also sort of it's the Saigon of Afghanistan. It's the last man standing. It's the place you have to get to be evacuated. At least that's what it appears. And he makes his way to Kabul, and then sort of begins Operation Pineapple Express, meaning although you're texting with Nizam before that, you now need to put together a team to extract Nizam from Afghanistan. And I'm curious about how you go about putting together that team.
I was curious about that too, because the whole thing was, and that's a great way to describe it. It was like a macro to micro thing. So you had province after province was falling in early summer, and Nizam was texting me on Signal. He's like, Herat province just fell. Kapisa province. And it was like you were literally getting this play-by-play. And he nailed it. He said, I think the whole thing turns in a month. And he was 2 days off, but he could see it coming. But as that started to happen and we started to see, this collapse, it became very clear when I decided to get involved and try to help him, there's no way I could do that. I mean, I still had some connections. So I ended up reaching out to, and I mean, I'm not exactly a top draft pick for personnel recovery, man. I'm I've been retired for 10 years, and I'm a storyteller, I'm a playwright, and so that too was, I was just thinking, that was the other thing that was really bothering me. It was he needs somebody way better than me to lead this, because I haven't done this in a long time. So I reached out to a couple of Green Berets who were still on active duty, who had fought with Nizam, who I'd fought with. We knew each other. They were well connected. Had a couple of Washington insiders. Congressman Mike Waltz and I go way back. He was super helpful, gave me someone from his team. live in the book. And that was it. And we just started working. I did a little sketch behind me here, just kind of a course of action sketch on like what problems needed to be overcome to get him from his house, his safe house, through the city, past the crowd of thousands, to the Marines and others so that he doesn't get shot because he doesn't have any paperwork on him, right? How does he present himself there and get pulled through and then get on an airplane? So there were like 7 or 8 strategic challenges. They're all indicated in red. And I was just sitting there going, this is insane. There's no way this is going to work. But that was kind of where we were around the 18th or 19th of August.
So what's interesting is you put together Operation Pineapple Express, and it sort of has 2 battlefronts in my estimation, the way I see it. It has the on the ground challenges, the physical danger presented to Nizam. He literally has to negotiate his way from his uncle's house through the streets of Kabul, through Taliban checkpoints, up to the gates of the airport, which we've all seen the images of the thousands of people massed at each gate. He's got to make his way through that gate without actually being captured by the Taliban. But honestly, that seems like the less, that seems like the part of your challenge that was actually less difficult, if that's possible to describe, because you have then also the red tape battlefront, which you're trying to deal with behind the scenes, which is in essence, once he gets to the gate, then what? And I think anybody listening or watching can imagine what it's like maybe if your flight gets canceled and dealing with the flight attendant sitting there typing on the computer for who knows how long, way too long, and everything feels so removed and frustrated, and how do you prove who you are and how do you get a new flight? That's obviously a very shallow example or analogy, but the point is this red tape impersonal bureaucracy seems to be your biggest challenge, Scott.
It was in a lot of ways. It really was. And so it was a very complex challenge in the sense that you had the tactical problem. But, once Nizam got through, we thought we were done. I thought that was it, because we did what we said we were going to do. And then the signal rooms just started blowing up with different people. Hey, I heard Nizam got in. And I've got this guy. And pretty soon it was like, we were going, okay, what do we do? Do we keep going? Because the whole reason pineapple was even used was because that was a password that a diplomat who used to be a Green Beret threw out for him to use just on a cuff because he was about to get tossed. And so he said, say pineapple, and that became like a meme. I mean, but it was not a plan.
And I'm sorry to interrupt, but I only want to do that so that the listener fully understands the implication. Maybe the best thing to do then is for you and I to go through the tactical part of it first. So how did he get, I think the tactical part takes us up to the gate, right? So how did he get from his uncle's house to the gate? Now, for a lot of us, we're going to picture some type of a Jason Bourne type escort, one of you guys or a CIA paramilitary guy helping usher him through this precarious gauntlet. Or is it no? It's up to everyone from a distance to help him tactically negotiate this course.
Well, I will tell you, this is where the real credit needs to go to our Afghan partners, because the bulk of the people that we were helping, to include Nizam, were Afghan special operators. So they were very tactically proficient. They understood how to move tactically. They understood night link-up procedures. They understood complexity and chaos. But imagine you know how to do that, but now you have to move with your family, your 75-year-old dad, your 4-month-old baby. You've got your babies in each arm. You can only carry what you can put on your back. Your house was compromised the minute the Taliban rolled into Kabul because all of the records at the Ministry of Defense were captured. So you can't go back to your home. And if you do, it's only for a few minutes to grab what you can. And now you're living in a safe house or a motel, and your only connection with the outside world, it's like looking through a soda straw, is with this person on the other side of the world who you fought with. And you're in a signal room with them and you're texting. And what do I do? Where do I go? How do I move through this crowd? They know how to navigate the danger. That's not and they're having to train their families very quickly. Okay, here's how we're going to move tactically. Here's when we go through the checkpoint, this is what you say or don't say. When they start beating your mother, you do not say anything. You just endure. Like, these are the conversations that these men are having with their families, right? And what their cover stories are. They got that. But how do you, when they get there, how do you then present them responsibly as highly vetted and safe to this 18-year-old 82nd Airborne private, right, who has got a 4-foot hole in the fence that he may or may not pull them through? That became the real, tactical challenge for us.
And that's the part that I want to come to in just a moment. But let's not move past the street by street urban movement of these. And I love that you point out these are highly trained Afghan special operators. These are guys who know how to do this, but now they're doing it with their family, with their elderly members of their family. I mean, just help me through that. Help the listener and the viewer through that as well. Like, I know in Nizam's case, it was 4 miles he had to traverse from his uncle's house to the gate. And I know that he employed a taxi to help get through some of those checkpoints. But again, Nizam is representative and symbolic of Operation Pineapple Express, which got much bigger over time. I'm curious, how was this mostly at night? Was it literally creeping around corners with children and the elderly? Was it simply lying to the checkpoint Taliban? And then as you describe this and how this is the part I want to get to before we get to the red tape, which is, again, I think even hairier. But just give me some examples of these stories. And here's the question I want to ask. Were they all successful in getting to the gate?
Yeah, so the short answer on that is no. Unfortunately, they were not all successful. But there were far more successes than we realized. And what I would tell you is, so when we got Nizam through, that was one of those things where we looked at ourselves and we're like, holy crap, like that worked, but then when the calls started coming out for more, we decided to scale it. And so we opened up the Signal chat room and we brought in more what we called shepherds, and they had their flocks with them that they were guiding. So it became, at this point, okay, we have hundreds of people now. We've got to find some kind of mechanism. And that was where, and I'm getting to your question, is we ended up installing basically an underground railroad that would allow these special operators and their families to move in pre-designated times at night to different link-up points. And then our chat rooms were talking and had all kinds of connections, and we would drop pins and signal of where the known Taliban checkpoints were. So we had built a collaborative SIP map inside Signal that we were then sharing with the operators on the ground so that they could bypass the checkpoints and find routes that worked where they wouldn't get beat as bad. They were going to get beaten, but they wouldn't get beaten as bad, and they could have a good chance of making it through. And then also, as different gates opened and closed, it was like this surge of sea of flesh. And so what happened was we would collaboratively share. When one gate opened, an operator would say, I'm at North Gate. It just opened. It's only been open 5 minutes. And then we would put it into the chat room, move from Abbey to North Gate immediately if you can. And so they would move tactically over there. So a lot of that was using technology and collaboration and pre-existing relationships to be eyes and ears and allow them to move. Then once we got them into a loiter point, they would hold, just like airplanes lining up at LaGuardia. And then when their time in the queue came, they would drop into the sewage canal, move through the open sewage canal, and pulled in by our conductors, who were 82nd Airborne guys, in a 4-foot hole in the fence.
Whoa. So tell me more about that, because everything you described, your presence, the team of Operation Pineapple Express is virtual. It's a communications and logistics team. It's not man on the ground, until you just described this sewage situation. And now, but let me be clear. I'm still putting a pin in our conversation about the red tape, because I find that fascinating in of itself. But at some point, what you're saying is, and by the way, the gates like opening and like a swarm of people flowing in and out, I don't even understand that. Why were we doing that as Americans? Why was that happening at times? Because that's not vetting everybody getting through the gate. Now you're just getting in with a sea of humanity, which is very different than the situation you described, where your passengers, which you described them, your passengers are emerging from a sewage tunnel to an 82nd Airborne operative, man on the ground.
Yes, exactly. And we had no one on the ground, and we didn't try to put anyone on the ground, because our position was That's not gonna help the situation. You know, what we can. Where's the gap? The gap is those Marines and paratroopers and NATO soldiers on the wire are looking at a sea of faces, and they're not sure who's who, right? So from a vetting perspective, we know who they are, we know where they are, and they trust us, right? So if we can responsibly present these individuals, highly vetted, at the right place, right time, right signal, with a sound tactical link-up plan that reduces exposure to the NATO forces, then that's value added. And then they can decide if they want to work with us or not to put this railroad together, which they did. And we chronicle that in the book. But we were not on the ground. And honestly, I think we were able to play our position. And there were some people who went on the ground. And I think what they did was an amazing story. But that just wasn't what we did. We focused on being an enabler, to leverage our relationships, our time there, and our ability to work in real time in that kind of environment. And we'd done that kind of complex digital stuff before. Remote operations basically is what you're doing. You're managing people without you being on the ground, which is really very command and control of special ops does it all the time.
Okay, so that takes us to the red tape now, and you described it well. So you've gotten your passenger to the gate, and all he is now and his family is either one or half a dozen faces in a sea of 1,000 faces. And now he has to talk to, as you described, an 18-year-old Marine as to why he should get to come through the gate. And I find this, like I said, the most frustrating part of it. Like, what's happening behind the scenes for you to get not just that information available to vet them, but down to that 18-year-old Marine?
Yeah, I think this is still being unpacked. This is why I think it's so important, Will, that we've got to have public, transparent hearings on this. We've got to have after-action reviews. To my knowledge, senior special operations leaders and military leaders have still not conducted after-action reviews on this to the degree that we should, to learn what happened, particularly abandon our partners and that kind of thing. But so we don't fully know. But here's what I can tell you is if you look at the numbers of SIVs and people who were exfilled out, it was not the most at-risk people, right? So to call it the greatest airlift in American history, I think personally is disingenuous because, yes, we lifted a ton of people out, and hats off to the Air Force and the men and women on the gate. I mean, a Herculean effort in chaos. Like they should be lauded for centuries. However, the actual vetting of who came in and who came out was not indicative of who it probably should have been. That's our position on that. So a lot of these special operators who we had in the queue, we even had them manifested on buses, Will, with engines running, ready to be driven in. They just sat there and watched the last plane leave, right? So, I mean, so many of them were left behind, and we had them. We had them manifested, ready to go, and we just couldn't get the gates to open. It was complete chaos. Now, one more thing I just want to say on this. You know, even the generals on the ground, like, their phones were blowing up. You know, their phones were blowing up left and right with people, you know, from President Biden's wife all the way down to, like, whoever, and us calling and asking for, you know, let this person in, that person. So, I mean, I can't imagine what that was like either. But what we did put in place finally was a standing plan where we worked with the same individuals each night, each period of darkness, around a 4-foot hole in a fence.
Oh, so, and you've got to get me there. But, you know, again, I just want to put flesh on the bone for the viewer and the listener. So, you know, there's so many different red tape, you know, victories and hurdles. One of them is getting somebody on a manifest for a plane. Literally, I assume someone is standing there at the door to the plane seeing if your name is on a list, right? But that's actually the final hurdle. There's so many before that. To get him even to that point of being on the manifest, and then take me back to, and this is where the word pineapple comes in, and maybe it's best as told through the story of Nizam, or maybe Nizam was too early to your point, as after you got it nailed down. How did you get, again, that 18-year-old Marine to say, you're good, come through the gate?
Yeah, so once you got in proximity of the gate, whether it was Nizam or those who followed, the challenge was how do you get that person recognized and pulled through and then processed and then flown out, right? And then there's also, then what? Like, what refugee camp are they going to? Where are they going to resettle? We won't even probably get to that today. Like, that's been a whole different thing. But the immediate pressing problems are, how do you get them recognized at the gate, pulled through and manifested. And what was really crazy about this, and so cool, I've never really seen this before to this degree, was the number of volunteers in Pineapple and the other groups who came in and just started working that part of the problem. I certainly can't take credit for it, but what I can say is like this Kathleen Miles in the book, she contacts us. She's like, hey, believe it or not, I used to do this kind of stuff. I can help get them manifested. And I'm like, holy cow, okay. And so she's working the back end manifest, and she would type into the chat room, I have an aircraft inbound at this time with 60 seats on it. Send me information. Send me the slants on these people. And you would have these organized slants or manifests of information that were coming in, and they would start working it before they even tried to make their run through the gate. And then you had Zach and others, former Green Beret turned Syracuse school teacher, who's building baseball cards on every one of the commandos, special forces, and their families. So it looks like a picture, their standard name line, their birth date, their age, and number of people in the party. And then they're sending that to our points of contact in the 82nd ahead of time so that they've got baseball cards that they can look at and check and affiliate this person with, number in the party, and then pull them through without, knowing that they've been infiltrated or something. So there was so much self-organizing work that was happening. People would just jump in and just do what they needed to do. And if it wasn't sexy, it didn't matter. If you could add value to the complexity of that issue, they did it. And it was just, I look back on it now, we got up to like 150 people, and everybody had just self-organized into different buckets. And that's what they were doing. And you just, I think it's what happens in a time of crisis. Sebastian Junger talks about this when we're a community of sufferers, like a catastrophe or something happens. We just self-organize and we get after it. And I think that's what happened.
So you're also describing when Operation Pineapple Express evolved into a more well-oiled machine. But again, it got its name. And what I think this part is fascinating, this is with Nizam again, is how chaotic it really was originally, where you guys are emailing people pictures of Nizam, and then he's taking selfies and sending them to you, and then you're emailing them to the Marines, and you're hoping that email, and Nizam is instructed to say to the Marine, tell your commander to check their email, right? And then at the last minute, even when that doesn't work, he gets a signal from you guys, just yell pineapple. Tell me how that happened.
And Nizam is like, he's so funny because he's like, he just, his nature is just not to stand out. And he's so respectful and polite. And so we're like, because JP, the diplomat who told us to say pineapple, and he's a former Green Beret, we quickly we got his phone number just on a whim. And we told him the story in a matter of minutes, and he was like, okay, they're getting ready to toss your guy. Tell him to say pineapple. And it's just the first thing that came to his mind. And so we're screaming, Nizam, yell pineapple, because they're getting ready to toss him back out the gate. That's what they were doing. They were just throwing guys, because he had snuck in behind another family of green card holders. And so we're screaming, say pineapple. We're typing it in as fast as we can, doing voice text, and he won't do that because that's just not his nature. So he walks up to this bearded special operator, just looks at him with a smile and says, sir, I am the pineapple. And and the guy's like, you're the pineapple? He says, yes, I am the pineapple. And he goes, well, go right down that corridor and you're good to go. And so he walks down the corridor, and we're just like, I just like collapsed in the driveway, man. We had been up for like 3 days. It was insane.
But on the back end of that, JP had managed to communicate down through the military chain of command to get to a guy on the ground who understood what pineapple meant.
Yep, he had already communicated down to the Marines and others that that's what that meant. It was very early on in the process before any procedures were established. And so he just said, hey, if this guy says this, he's good, let him in.
Okay, so then give me so that's the journey of Nizam, and you've kind of in bits and pieces told me the journey. But once you're into the more polished version of Operation Pineapple Express, what would have been the process for a family who has gone through, as you described it, the Underground Railroad and arrived at the gate? How had it become less chaotic? What would that process have looked like?
Well, it didn't become less chaotic. What we just tried to do was tame the complexity a little bit with military order and planning. And so we basically, in the book, when you read it, there's really two parts to the book. The first part is Nizam's journey. And then the second part of the book is really scaling it up. And then the third part is the epilogue, is where I talk about like what we can learn. But so when we scaled it up, the reality was we had all of these people now on this manifest that there's no way that doing what we did with Nizam's going to work. Like, we knew the clock was ticking. We knew there was an ISIS suicide bomber running around out there somewhere, and that they were going to shut this thing down any way they could. I mean, that was common knowledge that they were going to try that. And we knew that the Neo force was leaving in a couple of days. So, we were on the clock. Everybody was on the clock. And this is why we just through a series of events, and you have to read the book to really get it. But what ultimately happened, Will, was we learned about a 4-foot hole in the fence that had been cut early on by a Finnish diplomat who we later met. And he had done it to get 2 Afghan women pulled through, right? So now the one company from the 82nd Airborne had that 4-foot hole in the fence as part of their, security purview. And they had made contact with Liv from Congressman Waltz's office in another thing that they would be willing to help if we could present a plan. And so we presented a plan that basically would be special operator commando types with their families. We would be the conductors. It would be an underground railroad. I mean, literally, Zach, the Syracuse school teacher who came up with this, his hero is Harriet Tubman. And he explained it to the 82nd Airborne captain as a reemergence of the Underground Railroad. And they would be conductors on the railroad on the one side where they pulled them through the 4-foot hole. And we would be they would be the engineers. We would be the shepherds that would guide them through. And then they would show a pineapple on their phone at the right place, right time. They would be prompted with the baseball card information by the 82nd. How many in your party? What's the name? If it was all good, they would be pulled through. And that became our mechanism for 3 periods of darkness.
What an evolution. What a logistical accomplishment in the midst of, as you mentioned, tragedy and suffering and chaos. Tell me the effect of the bombing of Abbey Gate, and tell me the back end of the story of Operation Pineapple Express.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, there isn't a day goes by that we don't think about the 13 and their families and the guys and girls that were wounded, and all of those Afghans who were hundreds were killed at that gate. I mean, that'll never go away. But but leading up to that, that shut everything down for all intents and purposes. When that bomb went off, the Neo was over. And I think deep down we all knew that when it happened that it was going to shut it down. And leading up to that moment when the bomb went off, what I am so in awe of is, one, the Afghans who said, we're not leaving. We understand that, because we were warning them, this was one of the areas where at times when I did have to be a leader, and I had to, what was really bothering me was there was all these people that we were responsible for milling around this gate, and we got to make sure they know that we're seeing a lot of threat reporting that says there's something going to happen soon. And when we would tell them, and when their shepherds would tell them, they were like, look, this is my only shot. If this is how I go out, this is how I go out. I'm not leaving. The Taliban are going to kill me anyway. And so that was really hard. And then at this point, things were starting to fall apart. Eagle Base had collapsed, and people were starting to just come to Abbey Gate, and it started to become a bit of a free-for-all. And there was this one group of young girls that we were trying to help get out, and they had come to us through another person who came in the chat room, and she was like, hey, I've got a group of girls that we thought we were going to get out at Eagle Base. They're in the canal right now. Can anybody help them? And that was, for me personally, when it started to fall apart for me, because I had seen so many kids killed in this war. I'd had a hand in it. And now all of a sudden, these young girls are trying to make it. But what was amazing was the number of Afghan special operators who jumped into the canal and were trying to find them when it went off. And we got a lot out right in the final minutes. I mean, I can't say enough about the Marines and the 82nd and the British paratroopers. Man, they stayed on that line and they just kept pulling people. And nobody talks about that, but it was just the most heroic thing I've ever seen. And to talk to these Afghan partners today and listen to them say what our people did in those final moments, pulling them in, it's just, I don't know, man. It's the stuff of legend, and I don't think I did it justice in the book. I tried, but it just, when that happened, everybody just. I remember Liv saying she just went to her shower, she turned on the water, she hadn't showered in like 4 days, and she just sat in the shower and cried. And I think all of us just, in our own way, just kind of stared into the distance and tried to make sense of it. And for those who lived through it, I can't imagine what it's been like for them. But it was such a gut punch, man, because we wanted to get more, but we just couldn't. And that was it. That was the end of it. And then it became a whole different thing. And that's where I decided to end the book. And what I would say on this is that those final moments, the way Americans showed up for their partners, boy, do we have something to be proud of in this country, man. I mean, it was something special.
How many did you save?
You know, we've tried to figure it out. I'd say somewhere between 700 and 1,000 got out through the efforts of directly or indirectly Pineapple Express. And there were groups that got a lot more than that. But I would say a large number of those were special operators and other at-risk women. The Minister of the Minister of Women's Affairs, the most hunted woman in Afghanistan, Hasina Safi, actually made it through the Express. She waded through that canal because the State Department and no one else would get her. And she went through that canal with her family and made it out. So a lot of people that you would just be like, what, came through that Express. And we're still learning that people that came through that we didn't know. And so we think maybe that's the number. I think that's close. Yeah.
Well, man, you said something about pride, and we can kind of return to the emotion here at the end of our conversation. I just hope you can find ways to feel proud, Scott. I mean, because it's just objectively such an accomplishment worthy of pride. And I think you and I both, I know you, and I will say it here for you as well. This isn't just, a Scott Mann story, obviously. These are Green Berets, largely, at least with Operation Pineapple Express. They're bureaucrats. They're Green Berets who've turned into politicians. They're people at every step of the food chain for the red tape and the logistics to save, as you said, somewhere between 700 and 1,000 lives. And I hope every single one of you included, can feel proud.
I appreciate that. I feel I'm just Rex and Anita Mann's son, man. Like, that's just who I try to be every day. And I don't know, I'm very proud of the people that did this. And I tell you, the other thing that I'm not backing up on is I feel like we need some serious accountability and transparency in what's happened here. The only way, 73% of veterans feel betrayed by this, 67% feel humiliated. That is not a small number. And it's the reason, if you look at recruiting and retention, I'm convinced of it. If you look at the exodus of people from the military, and frankly, a lot of our national security challenges, perhaps even Ukraine, evolved out of this, and we need some serious conversation and accountability around this, to include our generals and admirals. And I'm just getting warmed up on that, because we need to do this. We need to press the issue on this, because our veterans and our active duty members are not going to get past this moral injury until they feel that their leadership owns this problem, and that this cycle of abandonment that started with the Montagnards in Vietnam, then the Kurds, then the Iraqis, and now Afghans, is going to be put to rest once and for all. And we can't keep saying that we work with indigenous people and by, with, and through, and we take care of soldiers, if this is how we're going to handle the end of a war. It's not acceptable.
Wow. Powerful. Listen, Operation Pineapple Express reads like, because it is, a real-life Hollywood movie. It's an incredible book. If you want to hear a real story that matches any type of Hollywood fiction, I think you should read this book, Operation Pineapple Express. And I know this. I'm proud to know you, Scott Mann. Thank you.
Thank you, Will. I appreciate you, buddy.
Hey, it's Will Cain. Click here to subscribe to the Fox News channel on YouTube. It's the best way to get our latest interviews and highlights. And click to subscribe to the Will Cain Podcast for full episodes right now.